this is Tony Blazer back with another video here for the Motocross Vault on YouTube. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to cover Suzuki's first truly great open class motocrosser, the 1976 RM370A. Prior to the 370's introduction in 1975, Suzuki had a pretty spotty reputation as far as production machines went. The early models weren't very good, to be honest. In fact, in the open class, the Cyclone, which was the predecessor to the RM370, is pretty much infamously known as one of the worst motorcycles ever built. In spite of the fact that Suzuki was very successful racing with their works bikes, the production bikes weren't very good. And 76 is really kind of a watershed year for Suzuki with a full lineup of excellent motorcycles from 125 to 370. Great bikes all around, and really even today, probably one of the greatest motorcycles Suzuki ever built in terms of its competitiveness. Really a groundbreaking motorcycle. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell to let us know when we do a new one. And here we go. Hope you enjoy it. The 1976 Suzuki RM370. Before I get into the RM370, I wanted to set the table a little bit for Suzuki and its motocross program prior to this. Suzuki actually was the first of the Japanese manufacturers to get really serious about motocross. In the 60s, none of them were majorly into the sport. It was really just a European sport, mainly contested in Europe, and most of the guys were riding, some kind of a motorcycle built there. There's, something like a Husqvarna or a British BSA, something to that effect. In 1965, though, Suzuki decided they wanted to kind of dip their toes in that water and took some of their road race engineers and sent them to race motocross. The result was a run of pretty mediocre factory bikes, starting here with this RH65. These early ones were not very successful, obviously. They were power bands were peaky. They were much more geared towards road racing, as I said. Suzuki, Honda, most of the Japanese manufacturers are really big into road racing, but they didn't have much success or much experience with off-road motorcycling. So this was really a kind of a trial and error program early on. In 1967, Suzuki released their first production motocrosser, the all-new TM250. Now, this bike was available in very limited numbers. Reportedly, only 200 of them were produced, and it was a replica of the RH67, which was Suzuki's full works version they were racing in the Grand Prix. Now, this bike, like the earlier ones, wasn't a very good motorcycle. It had trouble even finishing motos in the GPs. Suzuki was still kind of struggling with figuring out the right kind of power to build the motor with. They were relying heavily on their road race experience, and these bikes didn't have a lot of torque. They really had to be spun up, and that wasn't really the ideal power band for motocross, but the Japanese were learning quickly. They actually started hiring some of the Swedes away to help engineer the bike. They basically were trying to copy what Husqvarna was doing, which was one of the leading brands at the time in the GPs. So even though the 67 TM250 and its works sibling weren't very good, things were about to get a lot better for the brand. By 1970, Suzuki was really starting to get things figured out on the works side of things, and they hired away multi-time 250 World Motocross Champion Joël Robert from CZ. Joël rewarded Suzuki with its first world title that year in 1970, and would end up backing it up again in 1971 in the 250 class again. Now, in 71, they would also hire another CZ rider by the name of Roger DeCoster to ride the 500 division on the new RH71, their open class racer. Just as Robert had done in the 250 class, DeCoster would bring success to the 500 class division for Suzuki. This first year in 71, he would take the RH71 to the 500 World Motocross Championship, delivering Suzuki its first world title in the open class. That same year in 1971, Suzuki would introduce a production version of the RH71, the all-new TM400 Cyclone. Now, the Cyclone, in all the literature, was said to be a replica of the bike DeCoster was riding in the GPs, but unlike the earlier TM250, this bike was not even remotely close to what DeCoster was riding. At this time in the Grand Prix, DeCoster and the factory team Robert were riding ultra trick machines that were featherweight bikes. But these bikes were weighing what like a mini class motocross bike would weigh today. They were super light, trick, titanium, all kinds of exotic handmade stuff, materials. They were like the very definition of a works bike. And this TM400 was basically a turd that he looked remotely like the bike DeCoster was riding. This original TM had a myriad of issues. On top of weighing about 50 to 60 pounds more than the RH DeCoster was riding, the frame was made of a mild grade of steel. It didn't use chromoly steel like you'd see on a modern motocross bike from KTM or somebody. It used a kind of a cheesy low-grade steel that was very heavy. Also, couldn't really handle the torque the motor made. This engine was very powerful. Came on like a light switch. It was really an on-off style of power. This is well before power valves and stuff. And this TMs were notorious for having an on-off style of power. It went from 0 to 100 in a split second there. And when that power band would kick in, it would kind of twist the frame around. The bike would really kind of behave unpredictably. It was really kind of a notoriously evil machine to ride. They would end up making the TM400 for a few more years. The last year for the TM was 1975. By then they had kind of engineered out some of those issues. The bike did get better over time. The earlier ones had some problems with the ignition and stuff. That was part of the wacky power band it had, where the ignition was kind of unpredictable and didn't always advance the timing at the right time. Had a lot of issues there. But in any case, the TM was notorious as one of the evilest handling bikes of the 70s, and Suzuki wasn't too happy. Wasn't too sad to see it go in 1975. In 1976, Suzuki retired the TM400 Cyclone for good and introduced an all-new machine, the RM370A. Now, the new RM was truly a works replica machine, much more than the TM400 Cyclone ever was. This motorcycle bore more than a passing resemblance to the bike that DeCoster was riding. And this time, like I said, it was more than just a cosmetic appearance. It was skin deep. The frame was new. It used a tough chromoly steel that was both much lighter than the old TM frame and much stronger. The bike used long travel suspension. In the interim between the time the TM Cyclone was originally released and the RM, Yamaha had introduced the world to long travel suspension. The YZ250 in 1975 had introduced Yamaha's first monoshock in a production machine, and this basically doubled the travel you would have seen like on a CRL Sonor or one of the TMs. The laid down shock gave it much better tracking in the rough, and for 1976 Suzuki brought that to their new RM motocrossers. Now, unlike the Yamaha, which went with a very innovative monoshock design, Suzuki had chosen to go with a DualShock design, and basically had done what some aftermarket people and backyard engineers had done for years and laid down the shocks. They came up with a new system they called the True Track, which was a triangulated placement of the swing arm shocks and the frame. You can see here. What that did was, by laying the shock forward, it allowed them to get more travel without raising the seat height greatly. You could always put, just taller shocks on it, but then the bike would be so tall you wouldn't be able to touch the ground. Plus, you make the bike real tall, it interferes with the handling. So by laying down the shocks, moving the mount, the lower mount back, and the forward upper mount forward, you got longer travel suspension without sacrificing things like handling. Now, this one thing that the Suzuki did really well was the bike definitely handled better than the Yamaha. The early monoshocks, while they did provide excellent rear-wheel travel, they did have some kind of strange handling quirks. The original monoshock had an issue with kicking. If you backed off the throttle in the rough, it tended to kick suddenly, and it's something known as Yamahop. Because of the way the shock was laid down, it connected directly to the steering head of the bike and just kind of reacted unpredictably at times. And these laid down shocks did a much better job of keeping the kind of handling characteristics people were used to while still giving you that long travel suspension that people wanted. On the motor side of things, the RM370A used an all-new 372cc two-stroke mill. This air-cooled two-stroke featured a 6.9 to 1 compression ratio. Also had a very trick upswept work-style through pipe. The maintenance-free PEI, pointless electronic ignition system, was also employed. This meant you didn't have to worry about cleaning and adjusting points, which was a really nice maintenance feature at the time. This motor was pretty conventional for the time. Its intake system was unique, however, to the RM. Now, at the time, two-strokes came in a couple of different flavors. Earlier two-strokes used what they called a piston port design, which means there's no reed valve in the intake system. The advantage of this is the motor has no encumbrances. There's nothing to fail there in it. But because of that, not having that reed valve, it would allow fuel sometimes to get back into the intake track when the as the piston uncovered the port. Now, a Honda CR250 Elsinore, CR125 Elsinore, the original ones used this piston port design. Now, early Yamahas here, you'll see on the right use a reed valve. Now, that's what you're going to find in any modern two-stroke these days. The reed valve, what it does is basically allows none of that unburnt gas to get back into the intake. When the reed valve closes, it prevents any of that from getting back into the motor. So the reed valve is a more advanced, more efficient design. Now, Suzuki for 1976 came up with a kind of an innovative system that combined both the piston port and the reed valve system. They call this new setup a power reed. Now, at low RPMs, the mixture was designed to go through just a straight piston port like it would in that Elsinore at the time. This was designed to give it very good low-end power, and then around 4,500 RPMs, the case reed portion would open up and allow more fuel down into the cases. This was designed, obviously, to give it kind of a wider power band was the thought behind it. Now, this is not a pure case reed like you'd find on a modern 125. It's kind of, like I said, a half and half design, and was very unique to the Suzukis of this era. One other unique feature built into the new RM370 motor was this compression bypass hole built into the exhaust port. Now, what that was designed to do was to obviously bleed off a little bit of compression to aid starting. This did help with kicking the little beast over. But if you did happen to stall it, one thing that did kind of stink about this motor was it didn't have primary kickstarting. And what that means is the bike, if you stalled it, had to be in neutral to start. Unlike a modern bike where you could just kind of kick it over, and as long as the clutch will disengage and get the bike to start, this RM had to be put back in neutral, which is a major pain in the butt. In terms of performance, the 370 ended up having a really great motor that year. The engine had awesome torque, really torquey, great mid-range power. Not a lot of top end. The bike definitely did its best work in the low to mid range. But on an open class bike, that's pretty good. Most, unless you're a lunatic or named Magoo, you probably don't want your 500 to rev to the moon. This 370 was regarded by most to be one of the best motors that year. It wasn't quite as powerful as the motor in the Yamaha or the Mako that year, but it had a much easier to ride power band, a super mellow, fun to ride engine, great motor in stock condition, and definitely one of the best motors in the class in 1976. Up front, the RM370 used a set of Kayaba leading axle forks that punched out an excellent, for the time, 8.6 inches of travel. Now, leading axle means the axle actually sits in front of the fork, the main fork line. Some forks prior to this had used a axle basically in the center line of the fork. By offsetting the axle forward, it not only improved handling, it also allowed the forks to have longer travel. Now, as you can see in this early version, the underhang is not really that great, but later, as they kept adding more travel, this underhang would become even greater below the axle and would eventually lead to one of the complaints that would lead people to switch to inverted forks later, because that underhang could get caught in ruts. In terms of actual performance, these forks were considered very good. They were very plush, well damped. There was no external adjustability, though. You couldn't. There's no dialing up the compression or rebound or anything. They were basically set from the factory. If you wanted to change any of the performance, you needed to get into them and either start messing with the valving or change the fork oil height and viscosity. That was really your only option. Like I said, this suspension was pretty simple for its time. If you're really fast, you probably will want to do something with the forks. Add some stiffer springs or something, and that definitely brought up the performance for fast guys. Out back, the RM370 used a pair of Kayaba gas charge shocks to pump out 8.4 inches of travel. This was considered obviously very good for the time. This put it pretty much on par with the Yamaha's monoshock at the time, and it offered much more travel than the previous TM had offered. Now, the shocks were adjustable for preload. There were 3 preload settings, but there was no adjustments for damping. If you wanted to change the damping, most people would just buy a different set of shocks. Now, in terms of stock performance, these shocks actually work really well. They were considered by most people to be the best rear suspension available in 1976. As long as the suspension was fresh, it worked really well. It was super plush, did a good job of following the track, didn't do any of that weird kicking stuff that the YZ monoshock did. Really performed well. Basically, the only problem with these shocks was fading. They were good for about 15 minutes of hard abuse if you were a fast guy on. After that, they'd kind of, the damping would go away. Uh, there was no remote reservoir on these, no additional way to keep them cool. Now, this is something that the Works bikes had. DeCoster's Works bike had the reservoirs, and in 1977, the stock RM would get this. It was obviously something that they realized needed to be addressed, so they added the remote reservoirs to kind of keep the damping more consistent over time. Like I said, most people who wanted a upgrade in suspension in 1976 were probably going to buy some aftermarket shocks. These shocks weren't, they weren't revalvable in the way a modern set of shocks would be, or a modern shock would be on a motorcycle. Basically, you trashed them and got something different, like a Fox shock or Luft or something at the time to improve performance. With its excellent suspension and strong chromoly steel chassis, the 1976 RM370 was an excellent handling motorcycle. The new bodywork was very slim. The tank was very narrow at the seat juncture. The tank itself held 2.1 gallons. It was made of aluminum. Really cool looking tank. It's one of definitely my favorite designs in terms of Suzuki bikes, and certainly Suzuki's of the 70s. This bike made my top 10 list I did a little while back. And part of the reason is I love the looks of this tank. It's definitely cool. Now the tank was made of aluminum, so that made it a little bit fragile. It's easy to dent these. That's kind of the only downside. It was much less durable than the plastic tanks that would come later, but it's a more elegant design in my opinion. The seat this year was considered stiff, although I think if you were to sit on it now, most of these seats feel like marshmallows, but in 1976 they thought it was pretty stiff. With the limits of the suspension at the time, the seat took a lot of that suspension work. That's why they were so thick, so padded your backside quite a bit. Turning was excellent in this motorcycle. Had a very nice steering feel. Stability was good as well. The bike handled great. Like I said, it was really a nice, light feeling motorcycle, way lighter than the old TM had been. Excellent handling motorcycle. Definitely the best handling of the 76 offerings in the open class, and one of the strong suits for sure of the RM370 this year. While the overall RM370 was an excellent motorcycle for its time, it did have a few problems. Certainly not more than any other motorcycles of the time. Like I said, you have to keep in mind that in the 70s, a lot of these bikes were basically fixer-uppers. So even the best motorcycles had some sometimes problematic issues. But in 76, the RM did have a few. A lot of people did not care for the shifting of the transmission. The detent was very easy to get either a neutral or grab two gears by accident, overshift as you'd say. So you might grab second and ended up with third instead. Definitely one of these things you had to be careful on. The rear exhaust here was pretty loud. It was not rebuildable. It was a tiny little thing. It's kind of a joke when you look at it and see how tiny it is for an open bike. It's a wonder that people didn't protest the bike just on that alone. But in addition to being loud, the muffler brackets broke on all of them. All the test bikes and all the magazines talked about it as one of those things you had to reinforce. It was only a matter of time before it failed. The airbox was also a nightmare to use. This was not an uncommon problem. Suzuki wasn't alone in this. I had a 78 CR250 and that thing was a nightmare as well. But as you can see here, the air cleaner was really tricky to get in there. You had to kind of squeeze it and bend it in a really strange way in order to get it inside the airbox itself. And if you didn't get it on there just right, you were sure to suck some dirt. And as you can see as well, there's literally no way to see what you're doing. You basically had to peel the filter back a little bit to get it over the flange, and then fish around with your fingers hoping you got it right. It was just a nightmare, and I'm sure many people probably blew up their 370 not getting this right. In terms of reliability, the biggest chink in the 1976 RM370's armor were its wheels. Both front and rear, the hubs were very fragile. The rear in particular, you had to watch. The sprocket bolts would come loose, and if you either over-tightened them or if you let them get loose, it would crack the wheel hub. The spring inside the rear brake was also fragile, and if it went, it would destroy the hub. The rear brake here was actuated by a cable that would tend to get clogged with dirt. That was really a pain in the butt. But that was more of a pain than the wheels. Like I said, if you had to watch the spokes like a hawk, you had to watch the rear sprocket like a hawk, or you were going to destroy the wheels, which would be a major bummer. The front cable as well was also problematic. It was prone to flex and also get clogged with dirt and fail at times. Overall, though, like I said, the arm was very reliable over time. I don't want to characterize it as it wasn't. Many of the magazines talk about how many hours they put on the motor. The thing was really durable. My experience with Suzuki's has not always been the best. I've had several of them over the years, and they've always seemed to kind of fall apart a lot faster than my Hondas and some of the other brands I've had. But for its time, this was a very good bike. Little things like their insistence on Phillips screws were a major bummer. This is something that Suzuki did even up into the 80s. They had always put kind of crappy fasteners on everything. This is one area where Honda was way ahead. These screws, like you see here on this exhaust flange, were a pain in the ass to take off. You had to have an impact driver. If you were smart, you're going to replace that with an Allen or a hex head or something that was easier to get on and off. But these darn Phillips screws were everywhere, and it definitely wasn't the hot setup. Those minor peccadillos aside, though, I just want to stress what a great motorcycle this was for its time. The 370 offered kind of a Mako-style power, really torquey, easy to use, kind of the exact opposite of what the open class bikes of the early 80s would be. The bikes that would basically kill the open class. This is basically a 70s version of what a modern four-stroke is now. It was really mellow, easy to ride, predictable. Wasn't the kind of bike that was going to yank your arms out of your sockets and terrify you. The suspension was great. It handled well. It was great looking. Just a really phenomenal motorcycle. And if you think about just how terrible the bikes that preceded it were from Suzuki, it's just amazing what a turnaround they made in '76. Suzuki today is they're kind of on tough times. Obviously, if you follow the sport, you know that they're financially aren't as on solid footing as some of the other brands, and their development cycle has lagged way behind them. But in the 70s, they were really at the forefront of motocross. They were dominating the GPs, dominating the world titles. They won multiple 500, 250, and they won like the first 12 or 13 125 titles in a row, which is pretty amazing. It's really kind of sad if you think about it now. Hopefully, JGR will get them back on the map, and maybe we'll see them get a field of GP team. Things get turned around here. But for the time, in the 70s, Suzuki they were on a roll. And in 76, they really hit it out of the park with the RM370. It's a good reason it's such a popular bike even now amongst collectors and vintage racers. It was just a great bike for its time, and just a great bike even today. If you like this sort of thing, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I post classic pictures and videos all the time. It's at Tony Blazier. That's TonyBlazier. And I have written, like I said, many of these articles on pulpmx.com, and you can go there and read about the RM370 and probably about 120 other classic motorcycles I've covered. If you like this sort of thing, remember to subscribe and ding that bell. Hopefully I'll get another one of these out in a week or two. And let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it and if you have any suggestions on what you'd like to see next. In the meantime, keep the rubber side down, and until we meet again, blaze out.